Welcome to our series of videos covering Microsoft Access. In this video, we'll examine how logical operators are used in queries. What is a logical operator and when do we use them in a query? When a query uses more than one condition as criteria, we have to use logical operators. There are two common logical operators we can use. First is the AND logical operator. With an AND logical operator, all of the conditions or criteria have to be met for records to be selected. The second is the OR logical operator. With an OR logical operator, at least one of the conditions or criteria have to be met for records to be selected. Let's look at the difference between the two using a real-world scenario. We're going to take a trip to the grocery store to purchase some cereal and milk. Now, I'm choosy about the cereal I want to buy. In all, there are three things or conditions I'm looking for in a cereal. All of these conditions need to be met to find the cereal I want to buy. This is where the AND logical operator would come into play. With an AND logical operator, results will be narrowed down. The first condition, I want a cereal low in sugar. That condition will narrow down my cereal choices a bit. The second thing I'm looking for is a cereal that does not contain nuts. The second condition must also be met, therefore it's an AND condition. The second condition will continue to narrow down the cereals I have to choose from. The last condition is that the cereal must be gluten-free. Using that final condition, these cereals have been eliminated from consideration. Putting all of these conditions together using the AND logical operator, we've narrowed down our selection to these cereals. We can now use a Venn diagram to illustrate how an AND logical operator works. The first condition, low in sugar, would return cereals that fit within one of the circles. The second condition, doesn't contain nuts, is represented by another one of the circles. The third condition, gluten-free, is represented by the last circle. The cereals that meet all three conditions are represented where those circles intersect. Now, let's go buy some milk. In choosing milk for my cereal, I'm not quite as choosy. In fact, I have some options. First, 2% milk would be just fine, any size. With that choice, there are several options to choose from. Another condition, 1% milk, any size, I'm good with that as well. Because I'm fine with either of these choices, an OR logical operator would be used. With an OR logical operator, results will be expanded. With that second condition, I've increased the milk selection to choose from. Adding one additional condition, what about fat-free milk, any size? I'm good with that as well. Now I have even more selections to choose from. Like the AND logical operator, we can use a Venn diagram to illustrate the results of a query using an OR logical operator. In essence, each of the three circles represent the conditions for purchasing milk. Anything that falls within any of those circles can be purchased. OR logical operators expand results, while AND logical operators narrow them down. How do you use logical operators in an Access query in Design View? In Design View, within the design grid where fields are added, below the show line there is a criteria and several OR lines. If you're creating a query where two or more conditions must all be met, in other words, a query using the AND logical operator, all the criteria will be placed on the same line. If you're creating a query using two or more conditions where any of the conditions can be met, in other words, a query using the OR logical operator, criteria must be placed on separate lines. For example, if I wanted to see guests whose last name is Smith or live in Scottsdale, I'd place the two conditions in these boxes. Now, let's try some AND and OR examples using an Access database. Here we have an Access database that keeps track of a landscaping company's customers, contracts, and invoices. I've already selected 8 fields for my query: first name, last name, city, contract amount, invoice date, invoice item, invoice amount, and invoice paid. Using an AND logical operator, let's add 2 conditions to the query. Let's find out which customers are from Grand Rapids that also have invoice amounts greater than $10,000. Before adding the criteria, it's a good idea to run the query first for 2 reasons. 1, to make sure it's producing results, and 2, to check how fields we're going to add criteria to are formatted and or how the field value is spelled. Without criteria, the query produces 172 records. The first condition, finding customers from Grand Rapids, here I can see how it's spelled in the city field. Now let's add the criteria. Before adding the second condition, I'll run the query to make sure I'm getting back results that I expect. Adding the criteria Grand Rapids has reduced the number of records from 172 to 39. Grand Rapids shows under the city field. These are the results that I would expect. So let's add the second criteria. Because this query is using an AND logical operator, meaning both conditions of Grand Rapids and greater than $10,000 must be met, we keep both criteria on the same line. Now let's run the query and see what we get. Under City, only Grand Rapids shows up, and moving over to the invoice amount column, all the amounts here are greater than $10,000. So both criteria have been met, and we've further reduced the record count down to 17. Now let's try a query using the OR logical operator. Our next query currently has no conditions specified. Let's run it and see what we get back. After running the query, it produces 172 records. For this query, we want to find out which customers fall under residential customer types, or education customer types, or having contracts amounts less than $20,000. Let's add some criteria. As with the previous query, after adding each criteria, we should run it just to ensure we're getting back the correct results. So first, we'll add residential under customer type. And now we'll run the query. And here we can see under customer type, the only records being returned are those that are residential customer type. Now let's add some more criteria. We'll add education to customer type. And because we're using the OR logical operator in this query, the education criteria goes on the line below residential. Once again, we're going to run the query and double check our results. So once we run it, we see that residential and education both show up under customer type. Let's add the last condition of contract amounts less than $20,000. Because this last condition also requires an OR logical operator, we'll place the criteria in the contract amount line, and we're going to make sure that it's below education. Now we have our three OR conditions. Let's run the query and see what's returned. Under customer type, we still have residential and education showing, but we've also picked up a few other customer types, such as commercial and government, as well as nonprofit. However, if we look at the contract amount for each of those different customer types, we can see that the contract amounts definitely are under $20,000. Adding that third condition increased the number of records as well. We now have 84 records showing. Using the OR logical operator will expand the number of records returned in a query. In conclusion, when a query uses more than one condition as criteria, you have to use logical operators. When all the conditions have to be met, an AND logical operator is used, while when any of the conditions can be met, an OR logical operator is used.